So first, thank you. Thanks a lot. I think I had to think more. Maybe I had to think more about the question, the formulation of the question. But what I was thinking before, I'm really passionate by this approach of watching through ecosystem also to watch a social ecosystem. And what I see is that, so especially working, I formulate the question. While I think about, as Jason Moore says, as capitalism as an ecology and an ecologic system, what makes sense for me is thinking also about competitivity and competition as a regulator principle, as a framework in how this ecologic system works. And I guess, and what I know about ecosystems is that competitivity exists, but in the interdependencies, but it goes with cooperation. When you work in the policy framework of food, and it is a bit what we were speaking yesterday, the issue of regulation of, for example, contracts and procurements, it goes on the basis of competition, because about standards of quality. Standards of quality are decided, and standards of quality then they compete. So what I see the main difficulties in doing all this parallel and working in the transformation of the food regulation systems is include this issue of cooperation in the structure of in the interdependencies of actors. So it is, and I think is all us as individual. We grew up, my generation, we grew up with neoliberalism, and we grew up with individualism as a framework, I guess. And it is very true also when we work together as network of producers. It is very difficult to shift as in cooperation as an efficient principle, which is efficient. So I don't know if you work together in the Food Council in this analysis of competition against cooperation, or if in the historical approach in studying the system of regulation, if you found this switch in the ecology of capitalism.
Wow, okay, I'll try. I think I better take that before we move on to the next one, because this is, and I'll invite other people who have any ideas about this to contribute. Some of it's about practice, and since we're in the Ariki seminar, I'll say also that I heard him say once in a talk, he's probably written it somewhere, but I don't know where, that there are 3 things to ask about the current moment, whatever it is you're doing. One is, what is cycle? Where are we in a cycle? What is cumulative? And what is new? Right? And it's a way of turning the conjuncture in a way, right? At whatever scale. So it could be in terms of your generation of neoliberalism that the emergence of some new forms are part of a cycle, and it could be a cycle that's 30 to 50 years. It could be a much bigger cycle, like modes of production or modes of life, if you want to call them. And I see it in a few places that are big, but they're not always talked about this way. Social economy and the practices of social economy and synergies that people find, and the willingness of people often young people, but they're more respectful of age than we were when I was young. We were so stupid, we said, never trust anyone over 30 when we were 20. Incredible lack of foresight. So, that their willingness to accept insecurity in a way that I find totally impressive, having had a stable career and now a good pension that I feel responsible to use well. But mainly because I know it's not anything that can be expected to continue. Right? So there is a way that the conditions are drawn forth from some people, a new willingness to be fluid and adaptable, and sometimes it looks like the old form of cooperation, social form, like cooperatives and so on. And sometimes it's quite new and includes a channeling of competition in a way that I see in the internet. So Wikipedia is such a brilliant example, but also the operating systems of people who really know, do Linux and that there is a kind of a competition that becomes channeled in a constructive way, right? And I think competition is part of our human inheritance, and we have to learn to channel it, not just not like it, right? And I think some of that is happening around Creative Commons and trying to learn ways to balance the individual rights and needs with the general good, right, in the case of the internet. In biology, there's a wonderful biologist named Lynn Margulis, and gender may have something to do with all of this. I'll just throw it out as a possibility. Some sociologist of science has to study it. But she devoted her career to looking at symbiosis and turning the she's a biologist who many people think should have won the Nobel Prize, and she didn't. But the point is that both competition and symbiosis or cooperation happen, as you say, in nature. And it's a question of how do we find the balance in our own thinking, and how that thinking guides our perception of what we see, what we look for in nature or in our social institutions, or both together. So I think we're in a process of deep learning now about how to live in a way that is cooperative not only with each other but with other species, with places, with the land, to live in nature well, and as part of nature, right? Not as something outside. So I don't know how to apply that exactly to competition between standards of quality, except I'll put it back to you, but this example I gave was the invention of a new standard of quality that was in serious tension with organics, which is an older one and it still exists, and that is still complicated for many producers in different ways, not just in this way. I think part of the answer is letting things die. I don't know if that applies to organics or not. I mean, that all of these things have to be discovered in practice, and that maybe ideas of adaptability and transformability might help us observe particular situations and ask about them, and that there's probably not a general answer, because what we need to do is learn to live with ambiguity, learn to live with complexity and with questions and ability and willingness to change course, to make mistakes, to be more agile. And in order to do that, we need to learn to trust each other and live together much more. We can't just build it we need to build it into some institutions, but we can't just rely on that. We've got the institution now, so we'll just continue to be as we are, right? That there's some deep understanding that we are all called upon to do as individuals of things like, what is my competition? What is my impulse to competition? What is my impulse to cooperation? how does power operate in me or through me or against me, and how can I learn to be constructive with it, not to refuse it because it's there, right? It's part of us, and we see it. We see it in some of the dysfunctions of our social movements, the competition and the power struggles, right? And the taking positions and I'm right, and and I think that's part of what we're trying to come out of. And I think everyone, not everyone, a lot of people are, and that this moment of reflection, where the dangers seem very great, and our short-term inherited institutions that we focus on the most, there's plenty more to draw on, plenty more, like commons, that we just need to look more broadly. We need to, and a lot of people are doing that, and this moment of crisis is maybe an opening. It is an opening for many people to do that, and so what you're doing, what I'm doing, I think what we're all doing here is trying to enter into that. I don't know if that's helpful. I can't tell you anything about quality standards. Julie,
Julie.
No, go first. No problem. Doesn't matter.
Look at these men cooperating. It's beautiful.
I'll pass the mic to Giuliano. I had just a very quick question to contextualize the thing. How many inhabitants has the town of Toronto, and does it matter as in the experience? Having it being a town, and I'm asking these to think how could this reproduced in a different setting, which is possibly characterized by smaller towns?
Right. So thank you for this very stimulating presentation, really food for thought. So my question is about language, because I was interested in your presentation, especially when you were using this resilience model, right? But for everybody that is familiar with social sciences knows that this word, this concept has been, we can say, abused, right? So from my kind of personal point of view, I'm not sure if I'm entirely right, but the notion of resilience comes from ecology, right? Comes from environmental thought, right? But then it has been somehow, again, mainstreamed, I would say more than mainstreamed, it has been depoliticized, right? So now we talk of resilience. If we're talking of deforestation in Africa, the World Bank is asking forest dwellers to be resilient. Or if you're talking about Syrian refugees in Lebanon, all policies of donors and humanitarian intervention ask refugees to be resilient, right? Again, but the big issue here is that resilience is about how do you adjust, right? How do you adapt? Basically, how do you keep things as they are, which
It's impossible.
So question becomes interesting when you start giving us this kind of dual interpretation of resilience, and you start to point to the question of transformability, right? So again, there is this question of language. Should we use again this notion of resilience as it is? Do we have better notions that can allow us to capture this particular space-time issues, this particular space-time convergence that allow us to see what's the right moment, what is the right space for transformatory change? Again, if we can talk, just we were discussing about this framework of opportunities and possibilities, and I was just thinking about land grabbing. Not because this is the talk of my presentation tomorrow, but because this idea of resources that are locked in, right, by a particular institutional configuration, it made me think again about the ways in which land resources and other resources, the commons, are being kind of hijacked in this new configuration. So again, do you think this is a framework that allows us to think about transformatory change, or and then again you pointed to the fact that this is transcalar, right? So you're not talking of change occurring at one level, but kind of coterminously at all levels, right? So I would like to hear more about this, right? To see if this model of resilience can be frame it differently, and if this can make sense to the kind of challenges and struggles that are happening on the ground. Yeah, thanks.
Would anybody like to comment on that, please? Yes, I'm not the only person to talk here.
I would ask.
Oh, you're going to ask. I thought you were going to answer.
Even everybody. Which one is the relationship between conflict and resilience?
Okay.
First, second. In the world we live, competition socially is for profit and power. What is competition in human nature, or generally in nature?
All right, I'm going to say a few things, and then I hope other people will say some things too. And that could include abstract statements, but very much also if you have experiences that this would either be useful to use or not useful to use, so that we can, have more cases kind of to look at. I appreciate no one's developed this, for a talk, but still, what experiences can you use to think this too? I'll just easily, Giulio, size of Toronto. Depending on whether you use the larger urban area or a smaller one, it's 2 to 4.5 million people. It's one of the largest cities in North America. It's certainly the largest city in Canada. It seems to me this ought to be easier in a small place, but I'm not sure. I don't know. One of the things that did happen in the 1990s, while I was chair of the Toronto Food Policy Council, was there was a forced amalgamation of the city. So, for people who know the history of the Greater London Council in the 1970s, when Margaret Thatcher abolished the Greater London Council, the central government had the power to do that, and the mayor and all the elected councillors were no longer there, and they had to have a new, Ken Livingstone came back much later, but they had to have all new council, and they had set up amazing institutions. And actually Tim Lang was head of the food part of that, and advised us when we were setting up the Toronto Food Policy Council. Well, our very right-wing government of the time in Ontario had the same powers and did that to Toronto. And our socialist mayor and our mainly majority left-wing progressive city council was just abolished. And they forced an amalgamation of the city of Toronto with all the suburbs. So, and this is a long answer to a short question. And in that process, many of these, there were other citizen councils beside the Food Policy Council, and all of them were in question. Most of them were progressive. Were they going to continue? And it was the genius of Rod McRae, whose picture was up there before, at working quietly and working with the alliances he'd set up already inside the city, but more broadly in the surrounding areas, so that we reconstituted the Food Policy Council. And what that did was it brought in many more cultural minorities, especially that Black Creek farm that is in a suburb, of Toronto, like the banlieue of Paris. I mean, it's not that different. And I don't know if it's the same in Italy. So that the challenges, but also the opportunities, changed with the change of scale that was forced upon us. That was a dangerous time. And I would say that there are difficulties of working coherently since then, since we're working on a bigger scale, as well as opportunities. So everything has changed. I said a little already about competition and cooperation. So maybe I should ask you, what you think is in human nature, because I said that I think competition is part of who we are, and that we need to learn to channel it well. And I don't think, I think you're right. I think because of the world we live in, it has been channeled, especially under neoliberalism, but more broadly under capitalism, it's mainly been channeled into power and profit. But it doesn't have to be. And this example of how people are trying to solve a problem in the operating system of an open source system. So these people who are, I've come to think of them this way. I could be wrong, and I would love to be corrected on this. But I wondered a lot. Now, why in the Linux open source system, you've got these people, there's not very many who operate computers that well. I'm certainly no one. They know it so well that they can enter in and solve the problems that are coming up. I don't even know what they are. Now, why do they do that? They don't get any money. No, I don't know their names. Who are they? They're in their basements somewhere, anywhere in the world, right? And I talked to a lot of the young people who would come and help me solve my very, very easy problems for them. And what I kind of came to think, and it might be a model for a future world, is that it's like sports. It's like if you're a tennis player, a really good one, you don't want to play against me. You want to play against another good tennis player. And if you're really concerned not about fame, but about recognition of your skill, you want somebody who can recognize your skill, right? That's the recognition you want. Now, I think our world has been distorted by fame as well as profit and power and celebrity and all of that. But we know the real thing, right? We know whose opinion we really care about when we're doing something that requires some skill, including theoretical work. So if these people working on these operating systems, they don't know each other personally, but they can recognize each other. Like if you're participating on a Wikipedia site, you don't know the other people. My daughter, I've never done it, but my daughter she's a philosopher, was working on the Heidegger site for a while. And she showed me, she said, well, this person has this line of art, because they kept changing it. They kept changing the entry, right? And they're having a conversation with each other, even though they don't know each other, to try to get to the best entry. And that doesn't mean they will end up agreeing even, but that's how they're competing. And that's how those people, I think, in the operating system are competing, that one of them solves whatever problem they're all working on, and everyone kind of gives them or her a high five, through the computer, right? And they move on to the next problem, So that there is a healthy way of problem solving, of wanting to be the one to solve it. That's fine. It's our collective problem, right? But not wanting to have power out of that. Just wanting to have recognition and then moving on, right? And that there's something way that respect and trust fits into a different way of being competitive. Does that make any sense?
Maybe you should say some more. Forget your language.
I don't think so.
No? Okay.
For example, if we think the primitive people to get food, they are obliged to cooperate. They are not in competition, or if I want to win in sport, it's not because I want to win against the other. It's just because I want me to understand where I can go. And I can do this process with the other people, not in competition. I don't know how to explain. If I want to see what I can do, I need the other. Meaning that I am cooperating with him or her. I'm not in competition, because without the other people, I cannot understand. So, in my idea, naturally, I am not to go into competition. I don't know if I can explain.
I think I understand. We need each other for everything.
We're social beings. Everything we do is in relationship. The competition is a kind of relationship. And not necessarily. That's what I'm asking. It's an institutional question. Can we channel our competitive urges in ways that fit with cooperation? So in order to compete in a tennis match, we have to cooperate that there will be a tennis match, with a lot of other people too. And similarly with Wikipedia, somebody has to be managing it in order for people to try, and there is an element, I think there is that's a little trickier, but I think there is an element of competition because people are disagreeing, right? Who has the better interpretation? But because they don't control the outcome, they have to cooperate. And for the moment, and I like this part of the model too, for the moment, this is the best entry that this group of people can come up with. Now, it's possible to abuse it, and that's why they have rules, about you can't put things on during a political campaign, there's certain things you can't say, and there are people who actually volunteer to play that role. I heard one interviewed on the radio before I was coming here. It was quite amazing. They were asking him, why do you do this? How did you get started doing this? He's now, anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is that I think as a species, right, and the young generation in particular, I see it at this thing called the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto, but they're everywhere, these shared office spaces, and people collaborate in all kinds of ways, that I think we're exploring new ways of combining cooperation and competition, that they're both always present, and that if we don't become conscious of it, on primitive people, whatever that might mean, like hunting and gathering societies, I'm not sure there's not some competition in there sometimes. I mean, they're so various, I don't know. But yes, they're forced to cooperate, of course, but we're not, and so we have to do it consciously. And in order to do it consciously, we have to be realistic about who we are. And we have to learn to see our own power impulses and our practices and the practices of others, and to work with them in a way that is constructive. I don't think we can make them go away. And I don't think they're only about competition. I think you can have power in a cooperative. You do. You can have power in any organization. Power among supposed equals in a professional collegium, right? I can try to make you wrong, or I can invite you to dialogue, Yeah. But I don't want to have the last word on this. So let's park it and come back if people want to talk about it. Or I'll ask you, do you want to talk about this more now, or should we do language and then maybe open it up to both? I'll just say a few things and we can all participate. So I was talking about the institutional structures here, but I think you can do exactly the same analysis for language. And I think that we'll first completely acknowledge that resilience is being used in a managerial way by powerful institutions, whether they're private or supposedly public. You know, a lot of them have been captured now, like the World Bank. And ask the question, do we want to let those powerful organizations have those words, like resilience and sustainability and ecology? You know, I'm hearing words all the time now, it's so strange, in the media, like the ecosystem of finance. The ecosystem of everything. Well, okay, that means people are kind of thinking about ecosystems, but it means they're preventing us from thinking about ecosystems, right? Because finance, if this task I'm proposing of combining social and ecological thought, if it has any merit, yes, we have to be able to think of finance using ecological models, and as Jason Moore puts it sometimes, that Wall Street is part of political ecology. Wall Street is a way of organizing nature, as well as Wall Street depending on nature in ways that are so mediated that it's very hard to recover it. So, what does all that mean? It means that in this time of very great change, the language is part of the change, and it may even be the most important part of the change, because it's with language that we think and understand and perceive the world, right? So things like cooperation, competition, how are we seeing it, right? And there's not a right answer, actually. Yeah. So I think that the real question is, well, let me just go back, because before resilience, which is a very particular model, for the Stockholm Resilience Center, a very particular set of models, sustainability. So in my perception, which could be wrong, it was in 2008 that the few pioneers in the power field were using sustainability. Mostly they were resisting it. And I think that crisis shook a lot of confidence all around in the power field too. And now everyone's talking about sustainability. And the question is, who defines it? And so we're in the power field, and now what do we do in that power field about sustainability? Do we let them, whoever they are, you know, because the field is full of people, and some of those people have grandchildren, you know, and so, you know, and some of them, as this example was trying to show, are inside the dominant institutions, and they're forced to come around, or they want to come around, the individuals. You know, it's a very tricky thing. So I think giving up on those terms is a mistake, because then we're always in this dance of creativity and appropriation. We're always inventing new terms, and they're always taking them. So in agriculture now, sustainable intensification, even ecological intensification, well, you know, that's not what we meant. You know, that's not what we mean. And at the same time, we know that mixed farming, things like permaculture are incredibly intense. That is a very important way, different way to intensify land use, but all the measures go the other way. Yields per hectare of one crop. That's it, you know, or money that you get from selling that crop. So it's extremely hard to argue for productivity. You know, we have to learn to rethink all of these things. And there's not ever simple words, but I think giving them up is a mistake, and I think that's true of resilience as well. But it's a question. What I think is less important than the question, which is, how do we know, how do we decide, even if we're going to change our minds later, you know, to give up a term because it's been lost? Or to say, no, we need to do whatever we need to do, like change our measures, change our relationships, change our way of thinking in order to cultivate first what we mean, become clearer and clearer in practice as well as in thought, and move those changes. So the language, we can't live without the words, right? So, and I guess the thing that relates all of this is that I think our species, our human species, is being called upon to change our nature. And there's little doubt, if we think about it, that the capitalist mode of production changed our nature, right? We learned to compete in new ways, right? We learn to discipline ourselves in time, to internalize things. How many things can we say that became part of our nature that hadn't been before? Our relation to space and time was a pretty obvious one, right? As well as to hierarchies and status, and you know, all those histories that we can interpret in various ways, but all point to deep changes in how we experience ourselves, how we live, what qualities are new, what are old but cultivated and brought to the fore, what are marginalized, maybe it's cooperation. And that we're called upon now to make another cultural change, to move to another way of life. And so the ability to understand ourselves in institutions, I'm involved now, I take courses in something called Deep Democracy, which is a practice of learning to deal with power in organizations, meaning in yourself as well. And it's only one of many, 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 if you look around. They're everywhere. This organization I was going to in Greece that I mentioned, that's a lot of what it's doing. They talk mainly about technologies of dialogue. So that group, that's less deep in a way, but very important, dealing with questions of what kinds of topics can be discussed in groups of various sizes. They were holding public discussions in Syntagma Square with many, many people, many hundreds, I'm not even sure, more, maybe thousands, I don't know, many hundreds of people, but only certain things can be discussed that way. And which things are those? And which things have to be discussed in smaller groups? And how do those groups form? And how do they not get rigid? How do they have permeable but real boundaries with larger groups? And so things like Occupy was using, I don't think they invented it, a technology, as they call it, called open space, which you probably have experienced somewhere or other, right? Which is a much more fluid way of holding discussions than I'm doing right now. So I'm going to pass this microphone around. So there are practices and ways of thinking and intentions of being more democratic and more conscious about our own behaviors and the group dynamics and learning in kind of Asian martial arts way, you know, how to work with them constructively. Because if we deny them, we're in their power, you know. We get caught in competition and we don't know it. we're dysfunctional organizations and go, how did that happen, you know, or I'm like, it's all that person's fault. Not my fault, ever, right? And that's what we're needing to shift out of. And that's hard to talk about because it's experiential. So, let me ask, Giuliano to say more about the language and also the practices, you know. So, I'll just say one thing, like, I know I've been reading, because Mamadou Goita from ROPA gave me, on my computer, the land policies that were proposed to the government of Mali, and I think they might have passed them actually. And they're so sophisticated, you know? About combining customary practices with human rights, the rights of women and young people, about thinking about how you have territorial governance that incorporates both of those things. And so, to me, that was an example of, that is an example of how we can try to build new institutions that will be resilient, right? But that we also, and I think he'd be wanting to agree with that, don't depend just on those institutions we build. That we always have to be conscious and participating to keep them alive. Right? We can't, yeah, never mind. So.
Non ha da dire.
Gli ha fatto una domanda.
Avevi chiesto?
Lei le ha fatto una domanda.
Giusto brevemente. Sorry.
Brevemente.
Capisci? I'm sure you understand. I'm just shooting. No, I mean your argument is just making me think. Your argument is just making me think about, Mahmoud Mamdani, he recently wrote this book called Define and Rule. You know, right? The colonial mindset was about divide and rule. And he recently came up with this book called Define and Rule, in which he was just making up the point of how, colonialism was just not a matter of force, right? It was a matter of, was an hermeneutic issue, right? It was a question of how do we interpret the world. He uses a lot of, historical records. So I think this work that needs to be done is genealogical in a sense, right? Is a way of tracing the birth, the evolution, the transformation of a concept. Not in a kind of, as it is emerging in a vacuum, but showing what are the, this is a Gramscian take, if you like, right? Understanding how ideas and notions emerge out of particular historical conjunctures. They do not emerge just because of there exist brilliant minds, right? So I think that's what, but you also pointed to this question of connecting ideas and notions to praxis, which is perhaps the biggest challenge, right? And this is perhaps the realm in which we really need to invest. How do we translate ideas into first common sense or good sense, if you like, and later on, into transformatory practices. And yet again, in order to, we are dealing with a terrain here that is new. This idea of socio-ecological change, I think it's incredibly fascinating, but it's like we're venturing into a dark tunnel. You don't know where you're ending up with, right? So, but again, I think the hermeneutic question has a lot of centrality in your talk, and in the same way as often we use the notion of sustainability, we say some people say true sustainability. Meaning, there is an implication here that
there's false.
That there is one that is false, that is the one that has been used for 30 years, right? So perhaps the notion of resilience needs to go through that critical take too, because I don't see enough of that critical mass still opening up to the notion, though the notion is being used in very ambiguous terms, right? So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say.
Well, let me ask you can repeat it into the microphone, or anyone. If we start with ideas, and the question is how to translate them into practice or praxis, how do you think about materialism? Can we think also about the reverse, that it's in the practice and the reflection on the practice that we develop our ideas?
Well, ideas. We know that ideas are materials too, right? I mean, there is there is that big debate, right? I mean, there are people, especially Foucauldian people, that see ideas as being part of material structures, not necessarily. But I mean, your reasoning of moving from praxis to logics, if you like, makes a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure that we have to go through one, right? Perhaps it's two-way, right? And I think that's...
That was exactly the point that I want to make, in the sense that well, the general observation is that it works in two ways, and generally powerful institutions work top-down. So I decide I'm going to do something, I use an idea, and then I translate it into dominative practice. More or less, it's more or less what I see. But it works in the other way too. And best example, I mean, in my limited personal experience, this is what we, like in the experiences that I attend, that I participate in, this is what we're trying to do. And this is exactly where Harriet's talk talks to and provokes me in the experience of trying to promote social change from below. So to be clear, like I'm part of an association called SS Rosarno, cooperative, like, well, formal, well, it could be defined as a form of mutualism between farmers, activists and farm workers to try to change things. And then SS Rosarno, together with others, built a network, right? My privileged position of someone that does research, we were trying with other people, trying a lot to find the common element, and we came up with this idea that is mutualism. The common element is actually mutualism also as a political practice. So going back to what the labor movement was in the early days, in many senses. And one of the, well, some historians of the labor movement say that one of the nice things about mutual aid cooperatives or groups in the 19th century was actually learning from practice. So doing things and then together cooperatively, in a mutualistic way, decide what name you should give and what analytical or theoretical framing you should do. You should give to what you're doing. So perhaps, you're just pointing, the two of you were stressing one aspect that is both.
That's a great example.
And just to bring it, like I know you said you provoked us to a discussion, but I mean this is an open question, and what I see very fascinating, very much fascinating of the example you gave us is that in a way it happened also because of the university. So university is central there as an institution procuring food. So this is something that I encountered also to previous work on civic innovations, no? The role of students and the role of, the possible role of students and universities in bringing about progressive, transformative change in general. And it might be of this type, or I was dealing with the coalition of immobility workers, so something completely different, no? So supporting workers' struggles for change in the food system. Now, reflecting on this, my question was on two levels. Like, so university was there procuring, students were there pressuring and for a certain type of procurement. But my question did university had another role, meaning, and might be not forcibly the whole university, but like, more generally, what is the role that engaged researchers, scholars, and like including students into this, no? So like this kind of more sensitive, elements of civil society can play in this type of social change. Also in a very practical way. Was there any role of mapping out realities? Was there any, did you or other scholars or students play any role in mapping out who could be the farmers, what could be the ways to do certain things, or, engaging in conversation, like evaluating or assessing what was happening and promoting different solutions? Was there anything of these? Just as an example of possible roles that could be there. And I'm relating, this is a question to your experience, but in general, what do you think our role could be in this? No, like.
Maybe we should open it.
Can I add a little problem? When you explain this change in the last 10 years that were possible and which I think are very relevant because they refer to a role of institutions that were somehow closed, trapped in a system that begins to be changed. So we don't need to be blind about this importance of change. But what for me remains a problem is what kind of local farms products are substituting the long chain of corporate food, because it's not clear how the local farmers produce, what kind of is the local products also sustainable products in terms of labor relations and mode of production, use of fertilizers and so on. This is not, you didn't have time to explain, but it remains for me important not only to have local products, but to have local products guaranteed, produced in a certain way, not simply local. So when you say that the territorial dimension is central in this new model, as opposed to the corporate long chain and multinational food offer of products, is not sufficient. It's not only local important, it's what type of products, which means what type of farmers are included in this big change. which remains a big change in any case for me.
Okay, well, you know, proximity was just one of 5 dimensions, and they used a point system. So it was local and sustainable, and so the move toward a circular economy in the production system, the inclusion of animal welfare, of labor, fair treatment of labor, wise use of energy, all of those were parts of the certification system. Right? So, and the way it was done through points was, the point I made was they took this from industry, but that it's an interesting thing to take from industry. That things are being developed in many places, maybe for the wrong reason, but that might be useful to us, you know, and that we need to be scanning the environment. So this was a way of having a more collaborative, less hierarchical way to certify farmers, and it was one that helped them move to better production from wherever they started. So if someone started with chemical-intensive farming, then you would help them get off chemicals, right? And maybe they were using energy better. Maybe they were using animals better, didn't even have animals, you know? So whatever, within this 5-point system, with 5 categories, there were points in each one, whatever the limitation and the strength of each producer was, they would be helped to move toward that. Now they had to meet a certain minimum standard in each one in order to be accepted at all. And the idea was to increase the quality of that minimum standard for everyone over time, too. And it was also to build up the networks among sustainable producers, and not just farmers, but artisans as well, and suppliers. So the market developed something called the 100-mile delivery system developed, so that farmers didn't have to take their products. Right? Some of these are cooperatives already. Some of them are cooperatives of organic farmers, like the dairy, that already existed, that participated. So there's that. I think, you know, Giulio's point, I'm going to open it to I love neutralism, that you came to this way of thinking. And then I forgot what the other questions were. So I'm just going to pass this along, because I think we have a lot of really interesting questions on the table. And so people want to comment either on the ideas or on their experiences and how that relates to this way of thinking, about good or bad or whatever.
Passing it that way. Maybe everyone should say something, just whatever you have to say.
I was thinking that just a question first on the certification system that you have adopted. The farmers have to pay to get this certification, so it's like something similar to the participatory guarantee system that is used in Brazil, for example. Yes, it's the same. And another question was on the problem, for example, to apply public procurement canteen here in Italy, for example. We have the EU normative that block some
Trade agreements.
yeah. And when, for example, the university has to do they have to put on the market. So there is some ways to go through that Sonninos have underlined in some articles. But the problem is still, for example, here that farmers are small farmers. They have a low level of production that is not sufficient for So they have, or they have to cooperate, and otherwise there will be a problem. And I want to know here if in the experience of Toronto there were there have been also these problems among farmers, and how do you pass them, or if not?
Well, I'm a little reluctant to answer because I want everyone to talk. But I'll do it really briefly. Okay.
Yeah, no, this is important because about the farmers paying, they did not pay. And it was a principle of this organization that it would be nonprofit, and it was attempting to raise the income of farmers and to raise their ability to provide in a continuous way that was either adequate to scale or could be combined with other products in a way that would solve that problem. And it was understood very well that the problem, well, it was intended that the problems for farmers and artisans were the ones that were being addressed here. It wasn't mainly, well, I mean, of course it was for the students too, right? To have healthy food. And it was for the university to be a better institution in the world or something. But it was mainly about the producers. And that may have been the fatal decision for them, because it meant they relied on grants. And that's where they failed, because they would not, and in their founding organization, could not charge the farmers. So it's different from organic, it was, you know, in that way as well. No, I'm not sure, it depends. But the lesson in there for me is that, and why I have such respect for these people, right? That they were willing to let their organization die in a context where they had made some changes already, and it was time to move on. And maybe it was a mistake to have made that decision at the beginning, but maybe it wasn't. And maybe we don't need to know, right? What we need to be able to do is change course. Right? And so I hope that answered some of the questions. Yeah. So they made some differences, but not all.
Let's hear, what are you involved in any of this, Anne-Marie?
Me?
Yes.
In what?
Changes here in the food system.
The system. Just as a researcher.
Okay. So what do you know about?
I don't know how to explain. It could be long. I mean, we are going on the field to study the new alternative food networks.
And does this make any sense, this way of thinking with resilience, or not?
I have a problem with the concept of resilience.
Of resilience?
Yes. I have a lot of problems.
Okay.
Because I can't understand what does it mean. So it's very problematic.
Okay. Do you use other concepts that help you?
In understanding these new forms?
Yeah.
Yes, I use Marx.
Marx?
Yes.
How?
How? About his scientific reading of capitalism, and since the market and relationship, commodification. No, I mean, I don't know exactly. exactly all these concepts. But for example, resilience. For me, just to simplify, the conclusion is we are all together here as humanity, meaning we are resilient. I mean, it's a common sense that we are resilient in a way. First. Second, it is as we read the reality with the result of a process, naming it resilience. But what is before, what there is before, it's complicated.
It is.
I love the question you asked before about the relationship between resilience and conflict. Because he also speaks a lot to questions that I ask to myself. I should say I'm not familiar with the literature, like this type of literature about resilience. I encountered it in the work of a geographer, Cindy Katz, and she uses it in a very different context. She's talking about, she's trying to fracture, to be more analytical about everyday resistances. So she starts from weapons of the weak, from Scott's work. She says, yes, but if we name everything resistance, then we don't have a clue about all the differences. No? So she proposes to use 3 different concepts: resilience, reworking, and resistance, right? And in these 3, like in this scheme, she says resilience is getting by. It's what gets often criticized by more, let's say, orthodox Marxists in the analysis about everyday resistance. So it's getting by but not changing, surviving, we could say, no? Not changing broad things. Reworking implies small changes that are short terms but don't change the broader structures, and resistance is something that changes, that brings about more structural changes. Now I'm saying this to say that this is where I encountered the concept, and then I try to use these as a way to understand experiences like SOS Rosarno or the coalition of immobile workers, so experiences where workers are trying to change the food system. And I'm not been doing this alone. This was what I was doing together with Karen Sigman in ISS. And it's where everything gets confused, because we come back to the idea of how we name concepts and things. Because in all of these experiences, which are very, like SOS Rosarno is something that is trying, it's an experience that is trying to change the food system by building an alternative chain, by building an alternative way of farming. CIW is more like, we are workers, we are here, we are going to pressure corporations to approve a labor code that we have written, so it's structural, it's substantially different. But when we started to talk with the activists, and we saw that there's so many things that overlap. So that without everyday things that could seem more resilience-like, meaning having just a discussion at the end of the working day among people, because I noticed my fellow worker was abused by the gangmaster, so I go there and I have a chat, and this builds the trust. And on this they start, at the same time, there's something that looks more like a traditional form of labor struggle, which is more probably reworking but not changing. And in the end they arrive to actually say, oh well, no, you respect labor conditions defined as these and these, and these imply a different vision of what the chain could be. And I could make the same example, but in a short, in a short way, was that what I wanted, what I like in your question is that it points out exactly this: how small, small things, small everyday arts and practices and strategies are essentially interwoven with many other things. So maybe the word resilience, at least to me, also brings in things like, well, it's just survival, it's just adaptation, as you pointed out, but it could, it goes together with more transformative things, so transformability, as you were saying, but still, it seems more like a quiet encroaching, like it's of the system. Somehow it brings to me this kind of gentle building up in a transition. And so the question about what is the relationship with conflict, I find it super interesting. Like, because in everyday life, as we were saying, there's conflicts. So within the groups there must be conflicts. Or, yes, it was great, we have public procurement, and if we want to reproduce somewhere else, perhaps there's going to be very hard fights to actually get there. It couldn't work that gently, supposedly, but it wasn't. Yeah. So I've done a very long talk. I don't know if there was a point of my interest, but the point is that actually, this kind of confrontation with these terms, it probably brings about, the difficulty to actually describe analytically how change works, because in actually, sometimes in practice it's easier, because you don't get there, like, how do I define how I do these things, but it's a true question, I guess.
And maybe, and I want to hear from you too, but maybe talking about resistance would be useful, Juliana.
I was just thinking that this question of neutralism, which is a new term in a sense, but it somehow traces the reciprocity idea, right, of Polanyi, right? When we read Polanyi and the Great Transformation, or we read Thompson, we are talking about what you're discussing now, right? We are discussing about giving centrality to social relations. Right, and I think there was a fantastic paper that you wrote in the 80s, was called The Household and the National Economy, something like that, in which you were kind of discussing how this relationship within the household and between household were also representing an obstacle or an hindrance to commodification, right? And so when we discuss, do we start from ideas, do we start from practices? Well, I think that this is coming. My observation of the transformations that are occurring start from farmers' practices, right? And farmers' practices have really this, this informative role, in the sense that we do not necessarily need to come up, with new ideas or notions. Often it's just a question of how do we interpret reality, right? So it's not a question of coming up with the concept in the splendid isolation of our mind, right? But comes from this kind of dialectic of observing practices. So, for example, in northern Uganda, I find a lot of mutualism, a lot of reciprocity, seed exchanges, labor groups, all notions that go. These are institutions that come from practices, from historically defined practices, which are by themselves and in themselves against, all these forms of commodification and all these disruptive changes, right? So I find the notion incredibly important that it's not a casualty that it comes from someone that is engaged at the interface between research and practices. So it's already happening. It's us who are late, in the sense that research has always come late in identifying already existing responses. So I also think, in this sense, that the notion of resilience is very, say, academic in a sense, because people are already acting, so it's not, we don't need necessarily projects re-stimulating this or that resilience. Resilience is already the result of this capacity of people to adapt and adjust to these difficult conditions. Again, the question is, are we able to move towards transformatory changes, or should we get, because of course I've been writing on resistance a lot, and there is a bit of celebratory arguments we tend to make. But we also try to be critical in the sense that, again, resistance should also in itself incorporate this transformation of things, not just this sort of defensive pushbacks that often, if we think about, for example, resisting to land grabs, it's about keeping the status quo, whether positive or negative, but it's about keeping things as they are. And this is not necessarily always the good thing. For example, in contexts where you have highly patriarchal land management system, customary land systems, well, keeping that system in place might not necessarily be a great revolutionary act, right? So, yeah, that's it.
Just as a certain, myself and the fellow researchers who were writing about this experience, we didn't come up with the mutualism. It actually comes from the activists, no? And we were thinking about the many possible definitions of this, and then we just say, okay, well, they call it like this, and it's actually true, because if you dig into the history, in many ways, it's not just like the cooperation that specific aspect of the learning from practice was there, and it's a central feature of what mutual workers, mutual societies were.
You have real experiences.
No, I have not really what I can add. What I was thinking before it is, and it was coming about the issue of the language we were facing here, and going back, because in some ways thinking about the question you were doing at the beginning of today, and it was the challenging idea of why thinking again the relationship, why thinking back or thinking and the new relationships between the social system and the ecosystems. I was thinking about what's happening or what is often happening in the debate of networks, of actual networks we are facing, of people working in the food system in different ways, and people working mostly in the, we would say, coming from the ecology and starting working in the food system issue as producers, as logistics, I don't know, and people coming from social fights and working into the food system in the syndicate unions or rights issue. And so and now there is a moment that I'm finding very interesting, because we are starting dialogating a lot. Finally also finding this amazing connection between between the issue and why they are linked. And I guess because before in the debate there was the issue of what is the priority? Who can have the priority of fighting for environment if you don't have basic rights? And so this is why, and it is inside the challenge for me in how to make easy and understandable the complexity of this link between social and ecosystem. And I think about all this effort about thinking about metabolism and energy flows. So you say, okay, all these energy flows, so if there is a problem in the environment, finally, what are the classes of people who will suffer first? So there is all the issue of total energy and entropy. And I found that a concept was used for, it was trendy for a period, and then was not anymore trendy, and was useful in some ways for doing this complexity. It was environmental justice. Because it was easier, because it was like putting together two imaginaries. So the idea of justice, which is more linked, which is historically linked to social issue, and the issue of environment. So, and I found it, I really love like ecological pattern, but they are it is very a huge challenge to make complexity easy. I mean, which is an important challenge, but also in conversating, no? It is very easy in some ways with people really living in and depending on nature relationship in a place, because you understand the end of the world.
The people who can't buy bottled water when the water
Yeah,
is
sure.
polluted, or you know.
And so this is.
And we shouldn't have bottled water. We should have plain water. You know, so where the
Yeah. And what I was also thinking, it was about, and going back to the issue of complexity and competition, it is that for me, and also thinking about the design we do in permaculture, that you do in permaculture design, which is not an issue just of technical production, it's an issue of relation between human and nature. And so is that there is inside the design competition and cooperation, they are pattern of functioning, but then you decide in the design which are the principles. So it is like you decide equity, you decide ecological balance. So, and they can go and they can order this kind of a change and relationships. And finally, I was thinking about, and also thinking about the issue of competition we were saying, and issue of needs and conflicts. I was thinking this is just because it was a poetic moment of my life where in a very conflictive seminar, he's a sociologist but an activist in the Occupy movement in Spain, Angel Calle, and he always started all these moments of assembly and seminars saying this issue of we are beings who are interdependent and vulnerable,
yes.
but which is an important issue. And it is an issue in nature because the interdependencies goes with vulnerability. This is why we look for equity. And so this is not very useful, but it's very important for me in deciding relationship, organizing relationships in network, and thinking about the relationship in network with relationship in nature.
I'd just like to say a few things to Anne because it's clarified some things for me.
When we start with Marx, we have to remember that use values and labor, concrete labor, are the center of what is happening beneath the illusion of prices and the commodity fetishism. And for me, that was my journey here, is to look at the material flows of energy and matter that get, including food, that get converted into human energy, but everything. And so that's one piece. I don't think this is inconsistent with Marx, and I think we need to recover that deep question of the human relation to nature as the first step in the mode of production, that then in enacting becomes the class relations, the relations between people. And if we're trying, and if not just we're trying, but if it is happening that the capitalist mode of production is in crisis, and I do think it is, but not in the way that the 19th century interpretations have led us to believe, that the workers will grow in numbers and seize the factories and seize the state, and we'll have, as Lenin said, electrification with Soviets, and that we'll have capitalism that's just, you know, the same technical system that's just. We now know we can't have this technical system, and all these alternatives, not just we can't have it, it's not going to, it's destroying itself. And so that's part of the reality. And then I would just say more abstractly, in terms of using these ecological models, I was interested in what you were saying about resistance during the break. So if you want to say more about it, it'd be great. And if we want to eat, we have to deal with the material foundations here, you know, and energy that we should probably think about when we want to stop. But that the reason to use this model, for me, I'm happy to let it go if it's not working, and that's why I'm interested in whether it helps people or not, and I know it's challenging to take it up. But what I think the main point is that change happens, whether we like it or not. And it happens on different scales, and on different scales of time too, and with different depths. And what we have to do is learn to organize it, and that's why all this organize our perception. That's why all this transscalar thinking in time, in size of institutions, in territorial space becomes so challenging, and we don't have any guidance that I know of inside Marxism. And people have taken it up, and of course I'm glad to hear these references I didn't know too. But change happens, and it happens in the material world. I don't think it's at all given in a moment of climate change, species death, which I think is a better word than loss of biodiversity. And right now, the possibility of nuclear war today, you know, that we can talk about ourselves being a resilient species at all. What we hopefully are is a conscious species that can learn to see well. And so my motivation in all this is to really deeply acknowledge that change happens. And the Marxist idea of contradiction is one approach to that. So change happens inside the mode of production, change happens inside social relations, and that our task, if we want to make the world better, is first to understand it, not in this order, we have to do them at the same time, but that we need to learn how to think in order to guide it in the possible, in the way of the possible directions it can go, to be able to see and choose and guide it in those directions. Because otherwise, we are lost. You know, we're just wandering around with changes happening, right? And so to recognize, to bring back from the original Marx, the part that was pretty well lost for most of us, for most writers, the relation to nature as the center. Because if we're going to move into a new mode of production, we need a new relation to nature. And it's going to happen. And it might be extremely unpleasant and even fatal. Or we see what is possible. Not everything is possible, but certain things are. And so to learn to look at them. And that's my whole motivation here. And I'm so glad you brought up permaculture, because I do think that that is one of the practical ways that people have started to ask, how do we do it all at the same time, like right here in this space? And of course it can be scaled. But we don't know how, right? We don't know how. So how do we put all these things together? Thank you for bringing that in too. And I do think, I'm just going to quote Giuliano from the private conversation, that resistance, the word, I think it's the same, it's a Latin word, I don't think it's just English, that resistance is about pushing away. It's about pushing back. It's not about building new things. So maybe, I mean, you can resist by building new things, but the word doesn't capture it. And there's a way. Stephen Stevenson was a rural sociologist who said something once that a lot of activists around Toronto found very useful. He used archetypes. And the three were warriors who resist, right? And these are energies too. Builders, who build the new things, and weavers. And they're not separate, because if you are a warrior, you need to build up your social relations, your alternatives, in order to resist successfully. If you're a builder, you're going to have to defend them, because they will either be taken or destroyed. And if you're a weaver, then you're working, you know, and the same person can do all those things, or the same organization at different moments. So it's a balance of practices and energies, really. So I hope if that might be useful too. Do we want to say more, or do we want to have lunch?
We can keep on discussing that.
At lunch, absolutely.